In the harsh winter of 1881 Montana Territory, a pregnant widow's daily act of kindness would change 2 lives forever. Mary Hale rose each dawn to bake bread for hungry orphans, even as her own cupboard grew bare and her belly swelled with child. Her small stone oven at the edge of Sweetwater had become a beacon of hope for youngsters left parentless by mining accidents and fever. When cattle baron Gideon Cross rode into town that frosted morning, he expected to conduct simple business. Instead, he witnessed something that stirred his guarded heart: a line of raggedy children waiting patiently outside Mary's door, their faces bright with the promise of warm bread that cost them nothing but gratitude. The wealthy rancher had built walls around his heart, as high as those around his sprawling ranch. But watching this pregnant woman sacrifice her last measure of flour for others awakened something he'd buried deep. When a fierce blizzard threatened to cut off Mary's supply and leave the orphans hungry, Gideon faced a choice that would define the man he truly was. Would a hardened cattleman risk everything to save a woman whose generous spirit challenged everything he thought he knew about survival on the unforgiving frontier? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning air bit sharp against Mary Hale's cheeks as she stepped from her modest cabin, her breath forming small clouds in the pre-dawn darkness. 6 months along with child, she moved with the careful grace of a woman who had learned to balance hope with hardship. The wooden door creaked behind her as she made her way to the stone oven that had become both her purpose and her burden. Built by her late husband Thomas 3 years prior, the oven stood like a faithful sentinel at the edge of their small plot. Thomas had crafted it with his own calloused hands, using stones gathered from the creek bed and clay mixed with prairie grass. "For our future," he had said, pressing a kiss to her temple as they watched the first fire catch. Neither of them could have imagined that future would arrive without him, shaped by the needs of children who weren't their own. Mary's fingers traced the rough surface of the oven's dome, still warm from yesterday's baking. The ritual had begun 4 months ago, after young Timothy Fletcher had collapsed outside the general store, hollow-cheeked and trembling. His parents had died in the mine collapse that took Thomas, leaving the boy to fend for himself with nothing but pride and stubbornness. Mary had seen something of her late husband in the child's determined chin, and that night she had made a decision that would reshape her life. Each morning since, she reserved half her precious flour for the orphans of Sweetwater. The town had been carved from the Montana wilderness by men chasing silver dreams, and when those dreams turned to nightmares in the dark tunnels below, they left behind more than just broken rock. Children wandered the streets like autumn leaves, gathering in doorways and alleys, too proud to beg, but too hungry to pretend they weren't starving. Mary struck a match and coaxed life into the kindling she'd prepared the night before. The flame caught, painting golden light across her face as she fed larger pieces of wood into the oven's mouth. The warmth felt like an embrace in the bitter cold, and she allowed herself a moment to rest her hands on her swollen belly. The child within stirred, as if awakening to the familiar sounds of morning preparation. "Good morning, little one," she whispered. "Another day of sharing what we have." The irony wasn't lost on her. She who needed the most gave the most freely. Her own cupboard held barely enough flour for another week, yet she continued to divide her portions with mathematical precision. Half for the children, half for her and the baby growing inside her. Some nights she went to bed with her stomach clenching from hunger, but she slept peacefully knowing that 8 small bodies had rested with full bellies. As the oven heated, Mary prepared her simple dough: water, flour, a pinch of salt, and a smaller pinch of the precious yeast she hoarded like gold. Her movements were economical, practiced from months of repetition. She had learned to make much from little, to coax sustenance from scarcity through careful attention and patient hands. The first pale light of dawn crept across the eastern mountains as she shaped the loaves, 6 small ones for the children, 1 larger for herself. The dough felt cool and smooth beneath her palms, responsive to her touch in a way that never failed to bring her comfort. Thomas had often said she had a gift with bread, that her loaves held more than grain, and water they held love itself. From her kitchen window, she could see the town stirring to life. Smoke began to rise from chimneys, and the first brave souls emerged to begin their daily struggles. Sweetwater perched on the edge of civilization like a bird on a wire, always one strong wind away from being blown into the vast emptiness of the territory. The buildings were sturdy but sparse: a general store, a saloon, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, and perhaps 30 homes of varying sizes scattered along the main street and climbing the hillsides. The mine that had built the town dominated the northern ridge, its headframe stark against the sky like a gallows. Most of the men still worked those dangerous tunnels, chasing veins of silver that grew more elusive each year. The lucky ones came home each evening, covered in dust, but whole. The unlucky ones never came home at all, leaving behind grieving widows and confused children who couldn't understand why Papa wouldn't be coming back. Mary slid the loaves into the heated oven and settled back to wait. This was her favorite time of day, when the world held its breath between night and morning, when possibilities seemed to shimmer in the air like heat waves. She pulled her shawl tighter and let her mind wander to the life growing within her. Would it be a boy like Thomas, with his steady hands and gentle humor, or a girl with her own stubborn streak and fierce loyalty? The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted her reverie. Through the morning mist, she could make out a lone rider approaching at an unhurried pace. Even from a distance, the quality of his horse and tack spoke of wealth, not the rough prosperity of a successful miner, but something more refined, something that didn't quite belong in Sweetwater. As the rider drew closer, Mary could see he was a man of perhaps 40 years, sitting his horse with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being in control. His coat was well-tailored wool, his boots polished leather that caught the early light. Most telling of all was the gold chain that caught the sun as it stretched across his Vesta pocket watch that probably cost more than most families in Sweetwater saw in a year. Gideon Cross, she realized with a start. She had heard the name whispered in the general store and discussed in hushed tones at church gatherings. The cattle baron who owned the vast Cross Creek ranch, a spread so large it took a full day to ride from one end to the other. He was said to be a man who dealt in thousands of dollars as easily as others dealt in pennies, who could buy and sell half of Sweetwater without feeling the dent in his purse. What brought such a man to her humble corner of town? The bread's aroma began to escape the oven, rich and yeasty and impossibly inviting. Right on schedule, small figures began to appear from various directions, drawn by the promise of warmth and sustenance. Timothy Fletcher emerged from behind the schoolhouse, his too large coat hanging from his thin shoulders. The Morrison twins, Sally and Sam, crept out from the lean-to where they'd been sleeping since their mother succumbed to fever. Little Emma Carson, barely 6 years old, wandered down from the ridge where she'd been living in an abandoned prospector's shack. They formed their usual line without being asked, patient and quiet as church mice. Mary's heart clenched at the sight of them, so small, so resilient, so determined to maintain their dignity even in the face of desperate need. They never asked for the bread, never demanded or complained. They simply appeared each morning like faithful congregants, trusting in her consistency with a faith that humbled her. Gideon Cross had reined in his horse near the general store, but his attention seemed fixed on the small gathering outside Mary's cabin. She watched him, watching them, noting the way his weathered features shifted from casual interest to something more complex. His horse stamped impatiently, eager to continue to wherever they were headed, but its rider remained still as stone. The timer in Mary's head told her the bread was ready. She pulled the loaves from the oven with practiced efficiency, the crusts golden brown and singing with tiny cracks as they met the cool air. The children's faces brightened at the sight, though they maintained their respectful distance until she was ready. "Good morning, young ones," Mary called out, her voice carrying easily in the crisp air. "Another fine day to share what we have." They approached one by one as she broke the loaves into generous portions. Timothy first, as befitted his role as unofficial leader of their small band. He accepted his portion with a grave nod, his young face serious beyond his years. "Thank you, Mrs. Hale," he said, as he did every morning. "My ma always said gratitude was the finest seasoning." The Morrison twins came next, identical in their shy smiles and careful manners. Sally accepted her portion with a small curtsy, while Sam ducked his head and mumbled his thanks. Little Emma was last, as always, her large eyes solemn as she received her daily blessing. As the children dispersed to find quiet corners where they could eat in peace, Mary became aware that the stranger on horseback had dismounted and was walking toward her. Up close, Gideon Cross was even more imposing, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that suggested he was accustomed to being obeyed. His dark hair showed threads of silver at the temples, and his eyes were the color of winter sky, pale and assessing. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that was polite, but somehow distant. "Gideon Cross, I was wondering if I might have a word." Mary wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron and faced him squarely. Close up, she could see that his expensive clothes couldn't quite hide the weathered look of a man who had spent his life outdoors. His hands, she noticed, bore the calluses of someone who still did his share of hard work, despite his obvious wealth. "Of course, Mr. Cross. I'm Mary Hale." She gestured toward the simple wooden chair that sat beside her door. "Please, sit if you'd like. I imagine you've had a long ride." He remained standing, his pale eyes taking in the humble surroundings, with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I've heard about what you do here," he said finally. "Feeding the orphans, I mean. Every morning, from what I'm told." Mary felt heat rise in her cheeks, though whether from embarrassment or defiance, she couldn't say. "They're hungry children, Mr. Cross. I have bread to spare." His gaze moved from her face to her obviously pregnant form, then to the small cabin behind her. Nothing escaped his notice. She realized not the patched roof, not the single window with its carefully mended glass, not the vegetable garden that would need replanting come spring. He was cataloguing her poverty with the same thoroughness he probably used to assess cattle or land. "Do you," he asked quietly, "have bread to spare, I mean?" The question caught her off guard with its gentleness. She had expected judgment, perhaps criticism of her foolish generosity, when she clearly had so little. Instead, there was something almost vulnerable in his tone, as if her answer mattered more than mere curiosity. "I have enough," she said, lifting her chin slightly. "We make do." Gideon Cross nodded slowly, as if her answer confirmed something he'd been wondering about. He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew the gold watch she'd noticed earlier. The chain caught the morning light as he checked the time, and Mary found herself staring at the intricate engravings on its case. It was beautiful in the way that only truly expensive things could be: flawless, precious, and somehow cold. "I come to town maybe once a month," he said, replacing the watch with careful precision. "Supply runs, business at the bank. I've never noticed." He gestured toward where the children had been standing. "They're easy to overlook," Mary said, her voice carrying a note of challenge. "Hungry children often are." Something flickered in his pale eye, surprise, perhaps, or recognition. He studied her face for a long moment, and Mary had the unsettling feeling that he was seeing more than she intended to reveal. There was an intelligence behind his weathered features, a sharpness that spoke of a man who had learned to read people as easily as he read market reports. "I suppose they are," he said finally. "Easy to overlook, I mean." He paused, seeming to wrestle with something internal. "How long have you been doing this?" "Feeding them." 4 months, Mary replied. "Since Timothy Fletcher collapsed outside Dawson's store, someone needed to help. And that someone was you." It wasn't a question, and Mary found herself bristling slightly at the tone. "It was the right thing to do. Even though he gestured vaguely at her condition, "in your own time of need." Mary's hand moved instinctively to her belly, protective and proud, especially then. This child will be born into a world where people help each other, or it won't be a world worth living in. Gideon Cross was quiet for so long that Mary began to wonder if she had offended him. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before, with an odd note of wonder. "My ranch sits on 12,000 acres, he said. "I run 2,000 head of cattle, employ 15 men year-round. I have a house with 12 rooms and a barn that could hold half the buildings in this town." He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "And I've never once thought to feed a hungry child." The admission hung between them like morning mist, fragile and revealing. Mary found herself looking at him with new eyes, seeing past the expensive clothes and obvious wealth to something raw and honest underneath. This was a man wrestling with his own conscience, and she had somehow become both witness and catalyst. "It's not about what you have, Mr. Cross," she said gently. "It's about what you do with it." He nodded slowly, as if her words had struck some deep chord. "Yes," he said quietly, "I suppose it is." The morning was warming slightly, and Mary could see more people beginning to stir in the town below. Soon the daily rhythm of life would claim them both. She would return to her simple routine of survival, and he would no doubt continue on to whatever business had brought him to Sweetwater. But for this moment, they stood in a pocket of unexpected understanding, two very different people connected by a truth that transcended their circumstances. "I should let you get on with your day," Gideon said, though he made no move to leave. "I'm sure you have things to do." Mary smiled, the first genuine warmth she'd shown him. "The day's bread is baked, Mr. Cross. The children are fed. What more important things could there be?" He stared at her for a moment, as if memorizing her face, then touched his hat brim again. "Mom," he said formally, but the word carried weight. "Thank you for the conversation." As he walked back to his horse, Mary found herself watching the way he moved, still confident, but somehow different than when he'd arrived. She had the strange sense that something had shifted in their brief encounter, though she couldn't have said what or why. Gideon Cross mounted his horse with fluid grace and looked back at her one final time. "Good day, Mrs. Hale," he called out. "I hope your baking goes well tomorrow." And then he was gone, riding toward the center of town with the same unhurried pace he'd maintained throughout their meeting. Mary stood watching until he disappeared around the corner, her hand still resting on her belly, where the baby had begun to stir with increasing restlessness. "What do you think of that, little one?" she murmured. "Quite an interesting morning, wasn't it?" The child within her gave a solid kick, as if in agreement, and Mary laughed softly. Whatever had just happened, whatever subtle change had occurred in the space between question and answer, she had the feeling it was only the beginning. In her experience, men like Gideon Cross didn't appear without reason, and they certainly didn't linger to discuss the feeding of orphans unless something deeper was at work. She gathered up her baking tools and headed back inside, already planning tomorrow's loaves. The flour sack was getting dangerously light, but there would be enough for one more day, maybe two if she was careful. After that, well, she'd face that challenge when it came, as she had faced all the others. Behind her, the stone oven began to cool, its work complete for another day. But the warmth it had shared would linger in small bellies and grateful hearts, a daily miracle born of love and sacrifice, and the simple belief that everyone deserved a place at the table of human kindness. 3 days after her encounter with Gideon Cross, Mary stood before her depleted flour barrel with a sinking heart. The wooden container that had sustained her daily bread ministry for 4 months now held barely enough white powder to dust her apron. She ran her fingers along the bottom, gathering every precious grain, and realized with stark clarity that tomorrow's baking would be her last. The last sack of flour sat on her kitchen table like an accusation, its burlap surface worn smooth from handling. She had purchased it 2 weeks ago, with the final coins from Thomas's small savings, money she had been hoarding for the baby's needs. The arithmetic was simple and unforgiving. Enough flour remained for perhaps 6 more loaves, enough to feed the orphans one final time before her generosity reached its inevitable end. Outside, the wind carried the sharp promise of winter's fury, Grey clouds gathered on the northern horizon like an advancing army, and the air held that peculiar stillness that preceded a serious storm. Old-timers in Sweetwater could read the signs as clearly as scripture a blizzard was coming, and it would be the kind that closed the mountain passes for weeks. Mary sank into a single wooden chair, her hand resting on her belly, where the baby seemed to sense her distress. At 6 months, the child made its presence known with increasing vigor, reminding her daily that her time of solitary struggle was drawing to a close. Soon there would be 2 mouths to feed, 2 bodies to keep warm, 2 souls dependent on her dwindling resources. The moral mathematics were brutally clear. She could stretch the remaining flour to last a week if she stopped feeding the children and rationed carefully for herself. The baby needed her to be strong, needed her to survive these final months of pregnancy. Logic dictated self-preservation, wisdom counseled restraint. Every maternal instinct screamed at her to choose her own child over the orphans who had come to depend on her daily kindness. Yet as she sat in the gathering gloom, Mary's mind filled with images of small faces brightening at the sight of warm bread. Timothy Fletcher's solemn gratitude, the Morrison twins' shy smiles, little Emma's wide, trusting eyes. These children had lost everything: parents, homes, security, and her humble offerings had become the one constant in their chaotic world. How could she explain that the bread would stop coming? How could she watch them return to the hollow-cheeked desperation she had witnessed 4 months ago? A knock at her door interrupted her agonizing deliberation. She rose carefully, her movements made awkward by her increasing bulk, and opened the door to find Timothy Fletcher standing on her threshold. The boy's face was flushed with excitement, his usually serious demeanor cracked by something approaching joy. "Mrs. Hale," he said breathlessly, "you'll never guess what happened at Dawson's store." Mary forced a smile, pushing aside her worries to focus on the child's obvious enthusiasm. "Come in, Timothy. You look half frozen." The boy stepped inside, stamping his feet to restore circulation. "That fancy rancher, Mr. Cross, was at the store this morning, talking to Mr. Dawson about supply orders. I was sweeping the front steps, earning a nickel, when I heard them discussing the weather." Mary's pulse quickened at the mention of Gideon's name, though she couldn't have said why. "Oh?" "He was asking about deliveries, Mrs. Hale, wanting to know if any freight wagons would make it through before the storm hits." Timothy's eyes sparkled with an excitement that seemed disproportionate to the mundane nature of supply schedules. "Mr. Dawson told him the last wagon came through yesterday, and there won't be another until the pass clears. Could be weeks, depending on how bad this storm gets." The implications hit Mary like a physical blow. No supply wagons meant no flour deliveries, no chance to replenish her stores, even if she had the money to do so. The town would be cut off from the outside world, dependent entirely on whatever provisions people had managed to stockpile. Her small reserve wouldn't just be her last floret, would be the last flour available to anyone in Sweetwater. Timothy must have seen something in her expression, because his excitement dimmed slightly. "Mrs. Hale, is everything all right?" Mary gathered herself, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Of course, Timothy. I was just thinking about the storm preparations." She moved to her cupboard and withdrew a small piece of yesterday's bread, wrapped carefully in cloth. "Take this with you. Make sure you find somewhere warm to weather the storm." The boy accepted the offering with his usual grave courtesy, but his young eyes were sharp with perception. He had learned to read the subtle signs of adult worry, a skill born from too much experience with uncertainty and loss. "There'll still be bread tomorrow morning, won't there?" he asked quietly. The question hung in the air between them, simple and devastating. Mary looked into his earnest face and saw not just Timothy but all the children who had come to trust in her constancy. Behind their careful politeness and patient gratitude lay a fragile hope that someone, somewhere, would continue to care for them. "Yes," she heard herself say, the word escaping before her practical mind could stop it. "There will be bread tomorrow." Timothy's face lit up with relief. "I knew there would be. You always take care of us, Mrs. Hale." He headed toward the door, then paused. I'll make sure the others know to come early, before the storm gets too bad." After he left, Mary stood frozen in her kitchen, the weight of her promise settling around her like a shroud. She had committed herself to tomorrow's baking, but what about the day after? What about next week, when the storm had passed but the supply wagons remained blocked? What about the weeks that would follow, when her own stores were exhausted and her baby's birth drew near? She walked to the window and stared out at the approaching storm clouds. The wind was picking up, sending dried leaves skittering across the frozen ground and making the bare branches of the cottonwood trees dance like skeletal fingers. In the distance, she could see other townspeople hurrying to complete their storm preparations, securing shutters, stacking firewood, checking the soundness of roofs and walls. Somewhere in that activity, she knew Gideon Cross was making his own preparations. His vast ranch would weather this storm easily, his barns full of hay, his larders stocked with enough provisions to last months. The blizzard that threatened to devastate Sweetwater would be merely an inconvenience to a man of his resources. Mary found herself wondering what he had thought of their conversation 3 days ago. Had her words about doing the right thing resonated with him, or had he dismissed her naive, philosophizing the moment he rode away? Men of wealth and power, she had learned, often spoke sympathetically about the struggles of others without feeling compelled to act. Sympathy was cheap, action required sacrifice. The baby stirred restlessly in her womb, as if sensing her agitation. Mary placed both hands on her belly and closed her eyes, trying to find the calm center that had sustained her through the months since Thomas's death. She had faced impossible choices before and found ways to persevere. Somehow, she would find a way through this crisis as well. But even as she tried to summon her usual optimism, a cold finger of fear traced its way down her spine. This was different from the daily struggle to make ends meet. This was a fundamental reckoning, a moment when her generous impulses collided head-on with the basic requirements of survival. She could not feed the orphans and herself indefinitely on good intentions and moral certainty. The wind gusted harder, rattling the windows and sending a shower of debris against the cabin walls. The storm was still hours away, but its advance guard had arrived with a vengeance. Mary moved through her small home, checking the security of shutters and doors, banking the fire to ensure it would burn through the night. These were the ordinary preparations of frontier life, the routine precautions that meant the difference between comfort and catastrophe. As she worked, her mind kept returning to the sack of flour on her kitchen table, such a small thing to carry such enormous weight. In the morning, she would measure out half the remaining contents for the children's bread, as she had done every day for 4 months. The ritual had become sacred to her, a daily affirmation that even in poverty, even in struggle, there was always something to share with those who had less. But after tomorrow, what then? The thought followed her through her preparations like a persistent shadow, refusing to be dismissed or resolved. She had made her choice in the moment, driven by love and habit and the trust in Timothy's young eyes. Now she would have to live with the consequences, whatever they might be. Outside, the first fat snowflakes began to fall, drifting lazily through the air before the wind could catch them. The blizzard was beginning in earnest, and Sweetwater was about to be cut off from the outside world for an indefinite period. Whatever resources the town possessed would have to sustain its people until the passes cleared and normal commerce could resume. Mary stood at her window watching the snow accumulate, her reflection ghost-like in the darkening glass. Behind her, the last sack of flour waited on the table, a monument to generosity and a harbinger of difficult choices to come. Tomorrow she would bake bread for hungry children one more time, but beyond that, the future stretched uncertain as the winter storm that was even now beginning to bury the world in white. The blizzard struck Sweetwater with the fury of an angry god, transforming the familiar landscape into an alien world of howling wind and driving snow. Mary woke before dawn to the sound of something large and heavy being dragged across her roof tree branches. She realized torn loose by the gale and flung against her cabin like battering rams. The windows rattled in their frames, and draughts of bitter air found every crack and crevice in the walls. She rose carefully in the darkness, her movements made clumsy by both pregnancy and the bone-deep cold that had settled into the cabin overnight. The fire had burned low despite her careful banking, and her breath formed small clouds as she coaxed new flames from the dying embers. Outside, the storm raged with elemental violence, but inside her small sanctuary, Mary began the familiar ritual of morning preparation. Her wedding ring caught the firelight as she worked, the simple gold band that Thomas had placed on her finger 7 years ago. She had never considered removing it, even in her most desperate moments when the small amount of gold might have bought a few more days of security. The ring was more than jewelry, it was a tangible connection to the love that had shaped her, the promise that continued to guide her choices even in his absence. This morning, as she measured out the precious flower for what might be the last time, the ring seemed to weigh more heavily on her finger. Thomas had been a man of infinite kindness, someone who would have understood her commitment to the orphans, even as he worried about their own unborn child. He would have found a way to help everyone, she was certain, though she couldn't imagine how such a miracle might be accomplished. As she mixed the dough, her thoughts were interrupted by an urgent knocking at her door. The sound was nearly lost in the storm's roar, but the rhythm was insistent, desperate even. Mary wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron and hurried to answer, expecting to find one of the children seeking shelter from the blizzard's fury. Instead, she found Gideon Cross, standing on her threshold, covered in snow, and leading a pack-horse whose burden was hidden beneath heavy canvas. His expensive coat was crusted with ice, and his face was reddened by the bitter wind, but his pale eyes burned with an intensity that made her step back in surprise. "Mrs. Hale," he said, his voice raised to carry over the storm, "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I have something for you." Mary stared at him in bewilderment. "Mr. Cross, what are you doing out in this weather? You could have been killed trying to reach town." He gestured toward the pack-horse, whose sides heaved with exhaustion. "I brought supplies. Flour mostly, but other things as well. Enough to last until the pass clears." For a moment, Mary was too stunned to speak. The implications of his words seemed too enormous to grasp, too generous to be real. "I don't understand," she managed finally. "Why would you—" "Because you were right," he interrupted, snow swirling around him as he spoke, "about doing the right thing, about what we do with what we have." He paused, seeming to struggle with something internal. "May I come in? My horse needs shelter, and we have things to discuss." Mary stepped aside wordlessly, her mind reeling with questions and possibilities. Gideon led his exhausted mount toward the small lean-to that served as her shelter for the milk cow Thomas had bought shortly before his death. The structure was barely large enough for one animal, but it would provide protection from the worst of the storm. As he worked to unsaddle the horse and unload the mysterious bundles, Mary found herself studying this man who had risked his life to ride through a blizzard with supplies for hungry children. His movements were efficient and sure, despite the brutal conditions, speaking of someone accustomed to hard work in difficult circumstances. The expensive clothes she had noticed during their first meeting were hidden beneath practical winter gear that bore the marks of real use. When he finally stepped into her cabin, stamping snow from his boots and pulling off his ice-crusted gloves, Mary was struck by how much larger and more imposing he seemed in her small space. His presence filled the room in a way that had nothing to do with physical size, bringing with it an energy that made the air seem to crackle with possibility. "Coffee?" she offered, falling back on the familiar rituals of hospitality while her mind struggled to process what was happening. "That would be welcome," he said, settling carefully into the chair she indicated. "It's been a long, cold ride." As Mary prepared the coffee, she became aware of his eyes following her movements around the small kitchen. There was nothing improper in his attention, but she found herself conscious of her simple surroundings in a way she had never been before. Her cabin, which had always seemed adequate for her needs, suddenly felt shabby and cramped in the presence of a man who lived in a house with 12 rooms. "The supplies," she said as she handed him a steaming cup. "I appreciate the gesture, Mr. Cross, but I can't accept charity. I have my pride." He wrapped his hands around the cup, using its warmth to restore feeling to his fingers. "It's not charity, Mrs. Hale. It's an investment." "An investment in what?" "In the kind of world I want to live in." He met her eyes steadily, and she saw something there that hadn't been present during their first matina, vulnerability that his wealth and status couldn't quite conceal. "I've spent 40 years building walls around myself, convincing myself that success meant standing apart from other people's struggles. Then I met a pregnant woman who gives away half her bread to hungry children, and suddenly my walls don't seem like protection anymore. They seem like a prison." Mary sank into the chair across from him, her coffee growing cold in her hands as she tried to understand what he was telling her. "You risked your life in this storm because of something I said?" "Because of something you showed me," he corrected. "I've been thinking about our conversation for 3 days, Mrs. Hale, about what it means to have enough, about what we owe to each other as human beings." He paused, staring into his coffee as if searching for the right words. "I realized I've never once in my life done something purely because it was right, without calculating the benefit to myself." "That can't be true." "Can't it?" His smile was rueful, tinged with self-recognition that seemed to pain him. "I built my ranch through careful planning and strategic thinking. I chose my business partners based on what they could do for me, even my marriage." He stopped abruptly, as if realizing he was venturing into territory too personal for their brief acquaintance. Mary found herself leaning forward, drawn by the raw honesty in his voice. "You were married?" "For 5 years. Margaret was beautiful, educated, from a good family back east. She seemed like the perfect choice for a man building an empire." His voice grew quiet, almost lost in the storm's howling. "But perfect choices and real love are different things, aren't they? She left 3 years ago, said she couldn't live with a man who treated life like a business transaction." The admission hung between them, vulnerable and real, in a way that transformed the atmosphere of the small cabin. Mary felt her perception of Gideon Cross shifting, the intimidating cattle baron giving way to something more complex and human. Here was a man who had achieved everything the world told him to want, only to discover that success without connection was just another form of poverty. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "That must have been difficult." "It was a relief, if I'm honest. The pretense was exhausting for both of us." He looked up at her, and she was surprised by the directness of his gaze. "But it made me realize something important. I'd built a life that looked impressive from the outside, but felt hollow from within. Until I saw you with those children, I'd forgotten what it looked like when someone acted from the heart instead of the head." Outside, the storm continued its assault on the little cabin, but inside, a different kind of weather was developing. Mary found herself seeing past Gideon's wealth and status to the loneliness underneath, while he seemed drawn to something in her that transcended their obvious differences in circumstance. The space between them hummed with possibility and danger in equal measure. "The flour you brought," Mary said, needing to return to safer ground. "How much is there?" "Enough for several months if you're careful, along with other supply salt, sugar, some preserved meat." I cleaned out Dawson's back room before the storm hit. His expression grew serious. "But there's a condition, Mrs. Hale. I want to help with the distribution. I want to be part of what you're doing here." Mary stared at him in surprise. "You want to help feed the orphans?" "I want to learn how to be the kind of person who feeds orphans," he said quietly. "I want to understand what it feels like to give without calculating the return. Will you teach me?" The question was so unexpected, so vulnerable in its honesty, that Mary felt tears prick at her eyes. Here was a man who had everything the world could offer, asking her, a pregnant widow, living in a one-room cabin, to teach him how to be human. The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so profoundly moving. "I don't know anything about teaching," she said. "I just do what feels right." "Then teach me to feel what's right," he said. "Show me how to see what you see when you look at those children." Before Mary could respond, the sound of the storm began to change, the howling wind taking on a different quality. They both turned toward the window, where the grey light of dawn was struggling to penetrate the driving snow. Morning had arrived, and with it, the daily decision that had become the defining moment of Mary's existence. "They'll come," she said, more to herself than to him. "The children will come, even in this storm. They trust that there will be bread." Gideon set down his coffee cup and rose from his chair. "Then we'd better make sure there is," he said simply. And as Mary looked into his pale eyes, she saw something that made her heart skip with an emotion she wasn't ready to name. For the first time since Thomas's death, she wasn't facing the daily challenge of feeding hungry children alone. Someone had chosen to stand beside her, not because he had to, but because he wanted to learn what it meant to choose love over fear, generosity over self-preservation. The wedding ring on her finger seemed to catch the light as she reached for the flour sack, and for just a moment she felt Thomas's presence in the room, not as a ghost or a memory, but as a blessing on whatever was beginning to grow in the warmth between two very different souls thrown together by a blizzard and the simple desire to feed hungry children. The blizzard trapped them together for 3 days, transforming Mary's small cabin into an island of warmth and unexpected intimacy. What had begun as a simple act of charity, Gideon's delivery of supplies evolved into something neither of them had anticipated. A deep sharing of stories, fears, and the kind of honest conversation that strips away pretense and reveals the heart underneath. On the second morning, as they worked side by side preparing bread for the children who continued to brave the storm for their daily sustenance, Mary found a small wooden toy horse abandoned on her kitchen table. One of the orphans must have left it behind the day before, carved with loving care from a piece of pine and worn smooth by small hands. The toy was simple but beautiful, its lines suggesting movement, even in stillness. Gideon picked up the little horse, turning it over in his large hands with surprising gentleness. "Who made this?" he asked, his voice soft with something like wonder. "Timothy Fletcher, I believe," Mary replied, watching his face as he examined the toy. "His father was a carpenter before the mine took him. The boy has inherited skilled hands." "It's remarkable," Gideon murmured, his thumb tracing the horse's flowing mane. "The attention to detail, the craftsmanship. He couldn't be more than 12 years old." Mary paused in her needing to study his expression. There was something almost hungry in the way he held the toy, as if it represented something he had never possessed but desperately wanted. "Did you never have toys as a child, Mr. Cross?" He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain carefully contained. "My father believed toys were frivolous. Distractions from the serious business of learning to manage wealth and property. I had tutors instead of playmates, ledgers instead of games." He set the horse down carefully, as if it were made of spun glass. "I sometimes wonder what kind of man I might have become if I'd been allowed to be a child first." The admission revealed so much about the man before her that Mary felt her heart ache with recognition. She had known Thomas's childhood story tales of fishing expeditions with his father, of building tree forts and catching fireflies on summer evenings. Her own memories were filled with her mother's laughter, and the warmth of a family that understood love was more valuable than any material possession. How different Gideon's world must have been, shaped by duty and expectation rather than joy and discovery. "It's not too late," she said gently. "To learn what it feels like to play, to find wonder in simple things." He looked at her with an expression so vulnerable it made her breath catch. "Is that what you're teaching me? Wonder?" "I'm not teaching you anything," Mary protested. "You're learning it yourself. I'm just providing the opportunity." As the day wore on, Mary found herself seeing Gideon through new eyes. The intimidating cattle baron gradually gave way to someone much more complexer, man who had been shaped by loneliness and expectation, but who possessed a fundamental decency that his upbringing hadn't managed to crush. When Timothy and the other children arrived for their bread, braving the storm with characteristic determination, Gideon's interaction with them was awkward but genuine. "Mr. Cross brought the flour," Mary explained to Timothy as she handed him his portion of warm bread. "He wanted to make sure you all stayed fed during the storm." The boys studied Gideon with the serious consideration children reserve for adults who might prove important to their survival. "Thank you, sir," he said formally. "That was mighty kind of you." Gideon knelt down to Timothy's level, bringing his considerable height closer to the child's eye line. "Mrs. Hale tells me you carved this horse," he said, indicating the toy that still sat on the kitchen table. "It's beautiful work." Timothy's face lit up with shy pride. "Papa taught me before he died, said working with your hands helps you think with your heart." "That's wise advice," Gideon said seriously. "I wish I'd learned that lesson earlier in life." Mary watched this exchange with growing fascination. Here was a man who commanded respect through wealth and power, learning to earn it through simple human connection. When little Emma Carson tucked herself against Gideon's side while eating her bread, treating him with the unconscious trust children showed to safe adults, Mary saw something shift in his expressiona, softening that transformed his entire face. "They're not afraid of you," she observed after the children had left. "Should they be? Most children are intimidated by wealth and authority. These ones see something different in you." Gideon was quiet for a moment, watching through the window as the children disappeared into the swirling snow. "What do they see?" "Someone who cares about them," Mary said simply. "Someone who sees them as people rather than problems to be solved." That evening, as the storm raged outside and they sat by the fire sharing a simple dinner, Gideon began to tell her about his ranch. But instead of the business details she expected, he spoke of the isolation that came with success, the way wealth had gradually separated him from meaningful human connection. 12 rooms, he said, staring into the flames. "And I sleep alone in every one of them. I have men who work for me, but not one I'd call a friend. Neighbors who respect my property lines but wouldn't miss me if I disappeared tomorrow." He turned to look at her, firelight playing across his weathered features. "How did you do it, Mrs. Hale? How did you build a life so rich in everything that matters?" Mary's hand moved instinctively to her belly, where the baby had begun its evening restlessness. "I didn't build anything," she said. "I just loved what was in front of me. Thomas, the children, this community. Love isn't something you plan or calculate. It's something you choose every day, even when it's difficult, even when it hurts. Especially then, the choice to love, when loving costs something, that's when it becomes real." Gideon reached across the small space between their chairs and touched her hand briefly, a gesture so gentle it made her breath catch. "You're remarkable, you know that?" Mary felt heat rise in her cheeks, along with a flutter of something she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death. "I'm just a pregnant widow who bakes bread, Mr. Cross." "Nothing remarkable about that." "Everything remarkable about that," he corrected. "The pregnant part means you're creating life. The widow part means you've known loss and survived it. The bread part means you've chosen to turn your survival into service to others. If that's not remarkable, I don't know what is." The intensity in his voice, the way he was looking at her, as if she were something precious and rare, made Mary acutely aware of the impropriety of their situation. A man and woman alone together for days, sharing intimate conversations and growing closer with each passing hour. If the townspeople knew, tongues would wag with righteous indignation. A wealthy rancher and a pregnant widow, the scandal would provide months of gossip. Yet sitting there in the firelight, with the storm creating a cocoon of privacy around them, Mary found she didn't care about propriety or gossip. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt truly seen by another human being. Gideon looked at her not with pity or judgment, but with something approaching reverence. He saw her choices not as foolishness or naive generosity, but as evidence of a strength he was only beginning to understand. "The baby," she said suddenly, needing to break the spell that was weaving itself around them. "It moves more when there's music or interesting conversation. I think it likes having company." Gideon's eyes dropped to her belly with an expression of wonder. "May I?" he asked, his hand hovering uncertainly in the air. Mary's breath caught at the intimacy of the request, but something in his voice, a longing so pure it made her heart ache, made her nod. She guided his hand to where the baby was most active, and they both waited in the flickering firelight. The child didn't disappoint, delivering a solid kick that made Gideon's eyes widen with amazement. "My God," he whispered, "it's so strong, so alive. He or she will be born into a world where people help each other," Mary said, echoing her earlier words to him. "Where kindness matters more than wealth, and where everyone has a place at the table." Gideon's hand remained on her belly as the baby continued its evening dance, and Mary was struck by the tenderness in his touch. Here was a man who had never known the joy of creation, who had built his empire through acquisition rather than generation. The wonder in his face as he felt new life stirring was almost heartbreaking in its intensity. "I've never felt anything like this," he admitted. "Never been part of something so miraculous." "Every child is a miracle," Mary said, "even the orphans. Especially the orphans. They've survived loss that would break most adults, yet they still have room in their hearts for gratitude and joy." "Like their provider," Gideon said quietly, his eyes meeting hers. "They learn from your example." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. Mary was acutely aware of his hand still resting on her belly, of the way the firelight painted his face with warmth and shadow, of the growing connection that seemed to pulse in the air between them like a living thing. Outside, the storm began to show signs of weakening, the howling wind dropping to a more moderate moan. Soon the blizzard would pass, the world would return to normal, and this strange interval of intimacy would become nothing more than memory. But for now, in the warmth of her small cabin with snow piling against the windows and a strong man's gentle hand feeling her child move within her, Mary allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to not face the future alone. The wooden toy horse sat on the table nearby, a reminder of the innocence that could be preserved even in the face of loss, and of the simple gifts that mattered more than all the wealth in the world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult choices, but tonight, for just a few hours more, she could pretend that fairy tales were possible and that sometimes the most unlikely people found exactly what they needed in each other. When the storm finally broke on the fourth day, it revealed a world transformed. Sweetwater lay buried beneath 3 feet of pristine snow. The familiar landmarks softened into gentle curves and mysterious shapes. The silence was profound after days of howling wind, broken only by the occasional crack of tree branches adjusting to their new burden of ice and snow. Gideon stood at Mary's window, his leather-bound ledger tucked under his arm as he surveyed the changed landscape. The book had traveled with him from his ranch, a constant companion that contained the meticulous records of his business empire. Every transaction, every profit margin, every calculated decision that had built his wealth was documented within its pages. But this morning, as he prepared to return to his previous life, the ledger felt like a relic from another age. "I should go," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "My men will be worried, and there's always work to be done at the ranch." Mary was kneading bread at her small table, her movements automatic after months of practice. The flour he had brought made the dough richer and more pliable than what she was accustomed to, and she found herself thinking about the luxury of abundance. "Of course," she said, not looking up from her work. "You have responsibilities." The formal distance in her voice made something twist in his chest. After 3 days of intimate conversation and shared purpose, the return to polite acknowledgement felt like a loss too profound to name. He had glimpsed something in her small cabin that had been missing from his grand house, a sense of meaning that transcended material success. "The supplies should last until spring," he said, still lingering by the window. "Longer, if you're careful with the rationing." "We'll be careful," Mary assured him. "The children and I have learned to make much from little." Gideon opened his ledger, the pages filled with neat columns of figures that suddenly seemed meaningless. His wealth was documented here in precise detail, the value of his land, his cattle, his investments. Yet nowhere in these careful calculations was there any accounting for the richness he had experienced over the past few days. How did one quantify the value of a child's grateful smile? What was the market price of feeling truly useful for the first time in 40 years? "Mrs. Hale," he began, then stopped. The words he wanted to say seemed too large for the morning air, too presumptuous for their brief acquaintance. How could he tell her that 3 days in her company had shown him the poverty of his previous existence? How could he explain that watching her daily kindness had made him question everything he thought he knew about success and worth? "What is it, Mr. Cross?" He closed the ledger with a soft snap, decision crystallizing in his mind like ice forming on still water. "I want to do more, not just bringing supplies, but being part of what you're building here. Would you consider letting me help on a more permanent basis?" Mary's hands stilled in the dough, and she finally looked up at him. "What kind of help?" "I don't know yet," he admitted. "I've spent my life accumulating things, but I've never learned how to build something that matters. You've created a community here, a place where people care for each other. I want to learn how to be part of that." Mary studied his face, seeing the vulnerability he was trying to hide behind his usual composure. "The town won't understand. A wealthy rancher involving himself with orphans and a pregnant widow. There will be talk." "Let them talk," Gideon said with surprising firmness. "I'm tired of living my life according to other people's expectations." Before Mary could respond, they were interrupted by voices outside the children, arriving for their morning bread, their excited chatter carrying clearly in the crisp air. The storm had turned their daily pilgrimage into an adventure, and they approached the cabin with the high spirits of survivors. Timothy Fletcher led the group, his face bright with cold and excitement. Behind him came the Morrison twins, little Emma Carson, and 2 newer additions to their informal family siblings named Jack and Rose Hartwell, whose mother had succumbed to fever just weeks before the storm. "Mrs. Hale," Timothy called out as they approached, "we made it through, all of us." Mary felt her heart lift at the sight of them, safe and whole despite the brutal weather. "Come in, all of you. Let's get you warmed up." As the children crowded into the small cabin, stamping snow from their boots and pulling off makeshift mittens, Gideon found himself studying their faces with new attention. He had learned their names over the past few days, heard their individual stories of loss and resilience. They were no longer anonymous orphans to him, but distinct personalities, deserving of care and respect. "Mr. Cross!" Emma Carson exclaimed, spotting him by the window. "You're still here." "I am indeed," he said, kneeling down to her level. "Were you worried about me?" "A little," she admitted with the brutal honesty of childhood. "Rich folks don't usually stick around when things get hard." The observation, delivered without malice or judgment, hit Gideon like a physical blow. Out of the mouths of babes came truth. He hadn't wanted to acknowledge that his class and privilege had always provided escape routes from difficulty and discomfort. When had he ever remained somewhere challenging simply because it was the right thing to do? Mary distributed the morning bread with her usual efficiency, but Gideon noticed something different in the ritual. The children's gratitude seemed deeper, more profound, as if the storm had reminded them how precious and fragile their daily sustenance really was. They ate more slowly, savoring each bite, and their thanks carried weight that made his chest tight with emotion. "Mrs. Hale," young Jack Hartwell said as he finished his portion, "Rose and me were talking during the storm. We want to help somehow. We can't pay for the bread, but maybe we could do work around here, chopping wood or carrying water." Mary's face softened with affection. "That's very thoughtful, Jack, but you don't owe me anything. The bread is a gift. Mama always said gifts should go both ways." Rose piped up, her 7-year-old voice serious beyond her years. "Otherwise, they're not really gifts. They're just, what's the word?" "Charity," Timothy supplied, and Gideon heard an edge in the boy's voice that spoke to wounded pride. "We don't want charity," Jack said firmly. "We want to be part of things, to help take care of each other." Gideon felt something shift inside him as he listened to this exchange. These children, who had every reason to accept whatever help was offered without question, were instead asking for the dignity of contribution. They understood something. He was only beginning to grasp that true community was built on mutual support, not one-way benevolence. "What if we expanded?" he heard himself saying. The words seemed to come from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. What if instead of just providing bread, we created something bigger? A place where everyone could contribute according to their abilities. Mary looked at him in surprise. "What do you mean?" Gideon's mind was racing, seeing possibilities he hadn't imagined moments before. A community kitchen, maybe. A place where people could share meals, but also share skills and stories. Where the children could learn trades, where families could support each other through difficult times. "That would take money," Mary said carefully, "and land and materials." "I have those things," Gideon said simply. "What I don't have is the knowledge of how to build something that brings people together instead of keeping them apart." Timothy Fletcher had been listening with the intense focus children brought to adult conversations that might affect their futures. "You mean like a place where we all belonged? Not just visiting for bread, but really belonging?" "Exactly like that," Gideon said, his voice gaining strength as the vision solidified. "A place where everyone had something to offer, and everyone's contributions mattered." The children began to chatter excitedly about the possibilities, their voices overlapping as they imagined this new kind of home. But Mary remained quiet, her expression thoughtful and somewhat troubled. After the children left to spread the news of Gideon's still-forming plan, she turned to face him directly. "Mr. Cross, what you're suggesting, it's not just about money or buildings. You're talking about changing how an entire community thinks about itself. Is that a bad thing?" "It's a difficult thing," she said carefully. "People resist change, even when it's for the better, and some folks in Sweetwater won't appreciate a wealthy outsider telling them how to live." Gideon nodded, understanding her concern. "Then I won't tell them. I'll ask them. I'll listen to what they need and try to help provide it. But I can't go back to the way things were, Mrs. Hale. These past few days have shown me what I've been missing." Mary moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered town where people were beginning to emerge from their storm shelters. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the sounds of shoveling and conversation drifted on the clear air. It was a scene of ordinary human persistence, of people working together to recover from nature's assault. "There will be opposition," she warned. "Some people will see charity where you intend partnership. Others will suspect your motives, wonder what you're really after." "What am I really after?" Gideon asked, genuinely curious about her perception. Mary turned back to him, her expression serious. "I think you're after redemption, the chance to build something meaningful with the wealth that's isolated you from real connection. But redemption can't be bought, Mr. Cross. It has to be earned through consistent action over time." The truth of her words settled over him like a weight and a promise combined. She was right, was seeking redemption, though he hadn't named it so clearly before. The question was whether he had the patience and humility to earn it properly, or whether his privileged background would lead him to expect results before he'd done the work. "Will you help me?" he asked. "Will you help me learn how to do this right?" Mary's hand moved to her belly, where the baby had begun its morning restlessness. The child would be born into whatever world they built here, and that responsibility weighed heavily on every decision she made. "I'll help you try," she said finally, "but on one condition." "Name it." "We do this together, as equals. Not as benefactor and recipient, but as partners building something neither of us could create alone." Gideon extended his hand to her, and she shook it with the firm grip of someone sealing a pact that would change both their lives. Outside, Sweetwater was digging out from the storm, unaware that the real transformation was just beginning. 3 weeks after the storm, Mary sat in her rocking chair by the window, her hands busy with the soft blue yarn that would soon become a blanket for her unborn child. Each stitch was a prayer, a hope woven into wool that would provide warmth and comfort in the uncertain months ahead. The baby had grown more active as winter deepened, responding to voices and movement with kicks that sometimes took her breath away. The hand-sewn blanket was her evening project, worked on by lamplight when the day's bread was distributed and the cabin grew quiet. She had started with white yarn, practical and clean, but Gideon had arrived one afternoon with a skein of the softest blue wool she had ever touched. "For the baby," he had said simply, as if expensive yarn were as common as dandelions. Now, as she worked the intricate pattern her mother had taught her years ago, Mary found herself thinking about the changes that had swept through Sweetwater since Gideon's proposal. The reaction had been swift and decidedly mixed, splitting the small community along lines that revealed old prejudices and new possibilities in equal measure. The opposition had been led by Harold Brennan, the mine foreman who served as the town's unofficial mayor. A hard man shaped by harder circumstances, Brennan viewed Gideon's involvement with suspicion that bordered on hostility. "Rich folks don't do nothing for free," he had proclaimed at the hastily called town meeting. "Mark my words, this Cross fellow wants something from us, and whatever it is, we'll pay for it in the end." Others had been more receptive, particularly the women who struggled daily to feed their families on miners' wages. Sarah Dawson, the storekeeper's wife, had spoken passionately about the need for community support during the harsh winter months. "If a man wants to help, and he's got the means to do it proper, why should we turn him away out of pride?" The children, of course, had become Gideon's strongest advocates. Timothy Fletcher had appointed himself unofficial spokesman for the orphans, arguing their case with a dignity that made grown men uncomfortable. "Mr. Cross don't treat us like we're less than," the boy had said during one heated discussion. "He listens when we talk, and he asks what we think about things. Ain't many adults do that." But it was the medical emergency with little Emma Carson that had truly tested the community's resolve. The child had fallen through thin ice on Willow Creek while playing with the other children, emerging soaked and shivering just as the temperature began to plummet with evening. Mary had been preparing dinner when Timothy Fletcher burst through her door, his face white with panic. "It's Emma," he had gasped. "She went through the ice. We got her out, but she's awful cold, Mrs. Hale. Real awful cold." Mary had responded with the swift efficiency of someone who understood that minutes could mean the difference between life and death. She had sent Timothy to fetch Dr. Henley while she gathered blankets and began heating water for a warm bath. But it was Gideon's arrival that had turned potential tragedy into miraculous rescue. He had appeared within minutes of Timothy's summons, carrying the unconscious child in his arms, as if she weighed nothing at all. His horse was lathered with sweat from a hard ride, and his face was grim with the knowledge of what they were racing against. Together, he and Mary had worked to restore warmth to Emma's small body, taking turns rubbing her hands and feet while Dr. Henley battled to restart her sluggish circulation. For 6 hours, they had fought for the child's life. Mary had seen a side of Gideon she hadn't witnessed before, a man who could remain calm under pressure, while his heart broke at the sight of a child suffering. He had held Emma when she was too weak to sit up, sung half-remembered lullabies when she cried from the pain of returning sensation, and stayed through the night to ensure she was truly out of danger. The incident had shifted something fundamental in the town's perception of their unlikely benefactor. It was one thing to provide supplies or propose grand plans. It was quite another to spend a sleepless night nursing a sick child back to health. Word spread quickly through Sweetwater about Gideon's vigil, and even Harold Brennan had been forced to acknowledge that perhaps the wealthy rancher's motives were more complex than simple self-interest. "Still don't trust him," Brennan had muttered to anyone who would listen. "But I'll admit the man knows how to tend a sick young'un." Mary's fingers paused in their knitting as she remembered the moment when Emma had finally opened her eyes and recognized her surroundings. The child had looked up at Gideon with perfect trust and said, "Did you save me, Mr. Cross?" His response, "We all saved you, Emma. That's what families do," had revealed depths of longing and love that made Mary's chest ache with recognition. Now, as she worked on the baby blanket in the quiet evening hours, Mary found herself grappling with emotions she wasn't sure she was ready to name. Gideon had become a constant presence in her life, arriving each morning to help with the bread distribution and staying through the day to work on plans for the community kitchen he continued to envision. Their partnership had evolved from tentative cooperation to easy collaboration, marked by conversations that ranged from practical concerns to deeper questions about purpose and meaning. He had begun to confide in her about his past, sharing stories of the loneliness that had shaped his adult life and the growing recognition that wealth without connection was just another form of poverty. In turn, she had found herself talking about Thomas in ways she hadn't been able to since his death, sharing memories that brought him alive again in the space between them. The attraction between them was undeniable, though neither had spoken of it directly. Mary caught him watching her sometimes with an expression of such tender longing that it made her breath catch. When their hands touched during their work passing bread, reaching for the same tool, helping each other with heavy tasks, the contact seemed to burn with possibility. Yet she was still grieving her husband, still carrying his child, still wearing the wedding ring that proclaimed her loyalty to a love that death had ended, but not erased. The baby gave a particularly strong kick, as if responding to her turbulent thoughts. Mary placed her hand over the spot where a tiny foot pressed against her ribs, marveling again at the strength of the life growing within her. In 2 months, perhaps 3, this child would enter the world and everything would change again. She would no longer be a pregnant widow, but a mother responsible for shaping a young life according to her values and dreams. A soft knock at her door interrupted her contemplation. She set aside her knitting and rose carefully, her movements made clumsy by her advancing pregnancy. When she opened the door, she found Gideon standing on her threshold with an expression of uncertainty that seemed oddly vulnerable for such a confident man. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said. "I know it's late, but I wanted to discuss the plans for the community building. I've been thinking about what you said regarding the need for local input." Mary stepped aside to let him enter, noting the way he removed his hat and boots with the automatic courtesy of someone raised to respect others' homes. "Of course. Would you like coffee?" "That would be welcome." As she prepared the coffee, Mary was aware of his presence filling her small space in ways that were becoming familiar yet still charged with tension. He had taken to bringing his architectural sketches to their evening discussions, rough drawings that showed his vision for a building that could serve multiple functions: kitchen, meeting hall, schoolroom, and gathering place all in one. "I've been thinking about what Harold Brennan said," Gideon began as she handed him his cup. "About outsiders imposing their will on the community. He's not wrong to be suspicious. I've been guilty of that kind of arrogance in the past." Mary settled into the chair across from him, noting the tired lines around his eyes. He had been working harder than usual lately, dividing his time between his ranch responsibilities and his involvement in Sweetwater's affairs. "What kind of arrogance?" "The kind that assumes money can solve any problem, that good intentions justify any approach." He sipped his coffee, staring into the dark liquid as if it held answers he was seeking. "I've been thinking I should step back. Let the community develop its own solutions without my interference." "Is that what you want to do?" "No," he admitted, "but what I want and what's right for the community might be different things." Mary studied his face, seeing the genuine struggle between desire and duty that marked a man learning to think beyond his own needs. "What if we found a middle path, a way for you to contribute without dominating?" "What kind of middle path?" "What if the building belonged to the community from the beginning? Not your gift to us, but our shared project that you help fund." Mary's voice gained strength as the idea developed. "Everyone contributes something: money, labor, materials, expertise. You provide what you can, but so does everyone else." Gideon looked up at her with something approaching relief in his pale eyes. "You mean true partnership?" "True partnership," she confirmed. "No benefactors, no recipients, just neighbors working together to build something they all own." He was quiet for a long moment, and Mary could see him turning the idea over in his mind, examining it from multiple angles the way he probably evaluated business decisions. But this wasn't business, it was something far more complex and precious. It would take longer that way, he said finally, and it would be more complicated, coordinating everyone's contributions. The best things usually take time, Mary replied, and complicated can be good if it means everyone feels invested in the outcome. Gideon reached across the small space between their chairs and took her hand in his. The contact was brief but electric, sending warmth up her arm and making her heart race with possibilities she wasn't ready to explore. "You're remarkable," he said softly. "The way you see solutions where I see only problems. The way you think about what's good for everyone, instead of just what's expedient." Mary felt heat rise in her cheeks, along with a flutter of the attraction she had been trying to ignore. "I just think about what kind of world I want this baby to inherit." His eyes moved to her belly, where the evidence of new life had become impossible to ignore. "It will be a fortunate child, to have you as a mother." The words hung between them, weighted with all the things they weren't saying. Mary was acutely aware of the late hour, the intimacy of their situation, the way the lamplight painted his face with warmth and shadow. This was dangerous territory, not just the physical attraction that seemed to spark whenever they were alone together, but the emotional connection that grew stronger with each shared conversation and common purpose. "I should let you get your rest," Gideon said, though he made no move to leave. "Tomorrow will be another busy day." "Yes," Mary agreed, though she found herself reluctant to end this moment of quiet connection. Another busy day. But neither of them moved, caught in the spell of possibility that seemed to weave itself around them whenever they were alone together. Outside, the winter wind whispered against the windows, but inside Mary's small cabin, something warmer than any fire was beginning to burn, something that promised to transform not just Sweetwater's physical landscape, but the emotional geography of two hearts learning to hope again. The discovery came by accident, as the most devastating revelations often do. Mary was helping Gideon organize his father's papers in preparation for the community-building project when she found the faded photograph tucked between pages of legal documents. The image was small and worn, its edges yellowed with age, but the faces it captured were unmistakably clear. Two men stood beside a mining operation, their arms draped across each other's shoulders with the easy familiarity of close friends. One was clearly a younger version of Gideon, same pale eyes, the same strong jaw, though his face bore the harder edges of someone who had learned to value profit over people. The other man wore a miner's clothes and a gentle smile that made Mary's heart stop with recognition. Thomas, her Thomas, standing beside Gideon's father as if they were the best of friends. Mary's hands trembled as she studied the photograph, her mind struggling to process the implications of what she was seeing. The date, penciled on the back 1878, placed it 3 years before Thomas's death, during the early days of the Cross Creek mining operation. But that was impossible. Thomas had worked for the Sweetwater mine, not for the Cross family's interests, hadn't he? "Mrs. Hale," Gideon's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Is everything all right?" She looked up at him with eyes that felt too wide for her face, the photograph clutched in her shaking hands. "This picture. The man with your father. That's Thomas. That's my husband." Gideon crossed the room in 3 quick strides, taking the photograph from her nerveless fingers. His face went pale as he studied the image, and Mary saw recognition dawn in his expression like a sunrise she didn't want to witness. "I remember this," he said quietly. "Father was always talking about Thomas Hale, said he was the finest mining engineer he'd ever worked with. Honest, careful, someone who put worker safety above profit margins." His voice grew heavy with dawning understanding. Father wanted to recruit him permanently, offered him a position managing the Cross Creek operation. Mary felt the world tilting around her, familiar landmarks shifting into unrecognizable configurations. The Cross Creek mine? But Thomas never mentioned working for your family. He said he worked for Sweetwater Mining, for the company operations. "He did," Gideon confirmed, his voice growing more strained with each word. "After he turned down Father's offer, Thomas said he wouldn't work for any operation that put profit before people, that he'd seen too many corners cut in the name of efficiency. Father was, not pleased with the rejection. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity, creating a picture Mary didn't want to see but couldn't ignore. The mine collapse that killed Thomas. When did it happen? October 15th, 1881. Gideon replied. The date burned into his memory by grief and guilt. I remember because Father received the news during my birthday celebration. He was unusually affected by it. Mary felt something cold and terrible settling in her chest. Unusually affected, how? Gideon set the photograph down carefully, as if it were made of explosive material. He locked himself in his study for 3 days, wouldn't eat, wouldn't see anyone. When he finally emerged, he'd aged 10 years. He kept muttering about good men paying for other men's greed. His eyes met Mary's, and she saw her own horrible suspicions reflected there. Mrs. Hale, what exactly did the investigation into the mine collapse conclude? That it was an accident, Mary whispered. Faulty timber supports, they said. Poor construction that couldn't handle the geological pressure. She paused, her throat tightening with the effort of speaking. But Thomas had been worried about the safety protocols at Sweetwater. He'd been pushing for better supports, safer practices. The foreman told him he was being too cautious, that the company couldn't afford the delays. Gideon was very still, the kind of stillness that preceded either violence or complete collapse. What was the foreman's name? Brennan. Harold Brennan. Mary watched Gideon's face change as the name registered. Why? Do you know him? He used to work for my father, until Father fired him for cutting corners on safety equipment. Gideon's voice was barely audible now, weighted with implications too terrible to fully grasp. Father let him go 6 months before the Sweetwater collapse, said Brennan was the kind of man who would get people killed to save a few dollars. The silence that followed was deafening, filled with the sound of Mary's world crumbling around her. She stared at the photograph, at Thomas's trusting smile as he stood beside the father of the man she had been learning to love, and felt everything she thought she knew reshaping itself into something darker and more complex. Harold Brennan caused the collapse that killed Thomas, she said finally, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. And your father knew Brennan was dangerous, knew he cut corners, but he let him continue working in the mining industry anyway. Father should have reported him to the territorial authorities. Gideon said, his guilt evident in every line of his body, should have made sure he never worked another mine. Instead, he just fired him and let him become someone else's problem. Mary rose from her chair, needing movement to process the magnitude of what they had uncovered. So Thomas died because Harold Brennan valued profit over safety, and because your father chose to protect his own interests rather than warn others about a dangerous man. Yes. The word fell between them like a stone into still water, creating ripples that would never fully settle. Mary walked to the window, staring out at the town where Harold Brennan continued to wield influence, where the children she fed each morning played in the shadow of a mine that had been built on the same disregard for human life that had killed their fathers. The irony was bitter beyond description. The man who had killed Thomas was now opposing Gideon's efforts to help the very community his negligence had devastated. Does Harold know you know? She asked. I doubt it. Father never discussed his business decisions with me, and I was away at college when most of this happened. Gideon joined her at the window, his presence beside her both comforting and impossibly complicated. But Mrs. Hale, there's something else. Something I found in Father's papers that I haven't known how to tell you. Mary closed her eyes, bracing herself for whatever new revelation was coming. What? Legal documents. Papers that transfer partial ownership of the Sweetwater mine to the families of workers killed in industrial accidents. His voice was carefully controlled, but she could hear the emotion beneath it. Father drew them up after Thomas died, but he never filed them. I think he intended it as some kind of restitution, but he couldn't bring himself to follow through. The weight of this final piece of information was almost too much to bear. Mary pressed her hands against the window glass, seeking the cold shock of winter to anchor her in reality. He felt guilty. Guilty enough to plan a gesture of compensation, but not guilty enough to actually make it. Gideon's voice was harsh with self-recrimination. And I've inherited all of it, the guilt, the responsibility, the knowledge of what my family's choices cost yours. Mary turned to face him, seeing the pain in his expression and recognizing it as an echo of her own. Is that why you came to Sweetwater? Is that why you've been helping us? Because you feel responsible for Thomas's death? The question hung between them like a challenge, and Mary realized that his answer would determine everything that followed. If his kindness had been motivated by guilt rather than genuine caring, if his growing feelings for her were contaminated by a need for absolution, then everything she thought was developing between them was built on a foundation of lies. No, Gideon said firmly. I came to Sweetwater for supplies, just as I told you. I stayed because watching you care for those children showed me something I'd never seen before, what it looked like when someone acted from pure love rather than calculated self-interest. He paused, his eyes searching her face. I fell in love with your generous heart before I knew anything about Thomas or my father's connection to his death. Mary felt tears prick at her eyes, though whether from relief or renewed grief, she couldn't say. But now that you do know, now I know that my feelings for you are complicated by a guilt I don't know how to resolve. I know that everything I try to do for this community will be shadowed by my family's role in creating the problems I'm trying to solve. His voice broke slightly. And I know that you have every right to hate me for the sins of my father. Mary stared into his face, seeing the man she had come to care for warring with the weight of inherited guilt. Part of her wanted to rage at him, to blame him for his father's choices and his family's wealth built on disregard for human life. But a larger part recognized that Gideon was as much a victim of his father's failings as she was shaped by them, burdened by them, but not responsible for them. I don't hate you, she said finally, but I don't know how to love you either, knowing what I know now. How do I separate the man you are from the legacy you carry? How do I trust my feelings when they're tangled up with grief and guilt and the need for justice? I don't know, Gideon admitted, but I know we have to try to find a way forward for the sake of everyone who's counting on us. The children, the community, the future we've been trying to build together. Mary nodded, though her heart felt heavy with the weight of choices she wasn't ready to make. Outside, Sweetwater continued its daily rhythm, unaware that the foundations of its hoped for transformation had just shifted in ways that might change everything. The photograph lay on the table between them, a bridge between past and present that might prove impossible to cross. But somehow, they would have to try. For Thomas's memory, for the children who depended on them, and for the possibility that love might be strong enough to bear the weight of inherited sin and still find a way to bloom in the harsh soil of truth. The legal documents lay spread across Mary's kitchen table like tarot cards, predicting an uncertain future. Gideon had brought them the morning after their devastating discovery, his face grey with exhaustion and weighted with decision. The papers were yellowed with age, but legally binding transfers of mine ownership that would give the families of dead workers a stake in the operation that had killed their loved ones. Your father's signature is already on them, Mary observed, her finger tracing the careful script that had been penned 3 years ago in a moment of conscience that had never been acted upon. All they need is filing with the territorial authorities. And Harold Brennan's reaction when he discovers his authority has been legally challenged, Gideon added grimly. These documents don't just transfer ownership, they essentially accuse him of criminal negligence in the mine collapse. Mary's hand moved instinctively to her belly, where the baby had been unusually restless all morning. At 8 months pregnant, every movement was a reminder that her time was running short. Soon, she would face the challenge of childbirth, and whatever resolution came from this legal and moral crisis would determine the world her child entered. There's something else, Gideon continued, his voice heavy with reluctance. I've been investigating the current mine operations, looking into safety protocols and worker conditions. What I've found, He paused, struggling with the enormity of what he was about to reveal. Brennan hasn't changed, Mary. If anything, he's gotten worse. The supports are inadequate, the ventilation is poor, and he's been pressuring workers to ignore safety concerns in favor of increased production. Mary felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air seeping through the cabin walls. You're saying it could happen again. I'm saying it will happen again, unless something changes. The geological surveys show increasing instability in the main shaft, but Brennan has refused to authorize reinforcement work. He claims it's too expensive and would slow production. Gideon's hands clenched into fists as he spoke. 23 men work that mine, Mary. 23 fathers and sons and brothers who could die because one man values profit over lives. The weight of responsibility settled over them like a heavy cloak. They weren't just dealing with past injustices anymore, they were facing the urgent need to prevent future tragedies. The legal documents that could transfer mine ownership to workers' families weren't just about restitution, they were about saving lives. What happens when we file these papers? Mary asked. Legally, ownership of the mine transfers immediately to a collective trust managed by the families of deceased workers. You would be one of the primary stakeholders, along with the Mortons, the Fletchers, and others. Gideon's voice grew more confident as he outlined the legal framework. The trust would have the authority to hire new management, implement safety protocols, and ensure that mining operations prioritize worker welfare. And Harold Brennan would lose his position and face potential criminal charges for the negligence that caused the original collapse. Gideon met her eyes directly. He won't go quietly, Mary. Men like Brennan don't accept accountability easily, especially when it threatens their livelihood and reputation. Mary rose from her chair, needing movement to process the magnitude of what they were contemplating. The cabin felt too small to contain the weight of their decision, and she found herself pacing the narrow space between table and window like a caged animal. "The children," she said suddenly. "Timothy, the Morrison twins, little Emma there, all mine orphans. If we do this, if we challenge Brennan publicly, we're essentially saying their fathers died because of his negligence. Which is the truth? Truth and justice aren't the same thing," Mary replied, her voice sharp with worry. "Those children have found some peace with their loss. Are we right to reopen old wounds in the name of preventing future ones?" Before Gideon could answer, a sharp pain shot through Mary's back, making her gasp and reach for the nearest chair. The sensation was unlike anything she had experienced during her pregnancy, sudden, intense, and accompanied by a tightness across her belly that made breathing difficult. "Mary!" Gideon was beside her instantly, his strong hands supporting her as she fought to remain upright. "What's wrong?" "I don't know," she managed, her voice strained. "Something's different. The baby." Another contraction gripped her, stronger than the first, and Mary realized with dawning alarm that her labor was beginning. 2 weeks early, in the middle of a crisis that demanded clear thinking and careful planning. The timing couldn't have been worse. "We need to get Dr. Henley," Gideon said, his voice tight with controlled panic. "And Mrs. Dawson, she's helped with births before." Mary shook her head, fighting through the subsiding pain to think clearly. "Not yet. First babies take time, and I need to finish this conversation while I still can." "Gideon, if something happens to me—" "Nothing's going to happen to you," he interrupted fiercely. "If something happens," she continued with the stubborn determination of a woman who had faced loss before, "you have to promise me you'll file those papers. You'll protect the miners and their families, even if I'm not here to help you through the consequences." "I promise," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "but you're going to be here to hold me to it." The cabin door burst open without warning, admitting a gust of cold air and Harold Brennan himself. The mine foreman stood in the doorway like an avenging angel, his face dark with fury and his eyes taking in the legal documents scattered across the table. Behind him loomed 2 of his cronies from the minemen, whose loyalty had been bought with steady wages and the promise of continued employment. "Well, well," Brennan said, his voice dripping with false cordiality. "Ain't this a cozy scene? The rich boy and the pregnant widow, plotting against honest working men. Gideon stepped protectively in front of Mary, his body blocking Brennan's view of her vulnerable condition. "This is a private conversation, Brennan. You have no business here." "Don't I?" Brennan moved into the cabin without invitation, his eyes fixed on the legal documents. "When it concerns my livelihood and my reputation, I'd say I have every business in the world." He gestured toward the papers. "You think I don't have friends in the territorial office? You think word don't travel when someone starts asking questions about old mine accidents?" Mary felt another contraction building and fought to keep her expression neutral. The last thing they needed was for Brennan to realize how vulnerable she was at this moment. Through sheer force of will, she managed to speak calmly. "Mr. Brennan, as you can see, we're discussing private business matters. Perhaps you could return at a more convenient time." Brennan's laugh was ugly and without humor. "Private business? Lady, when you start spreading lies about decent folks, it becomes everybody's business." His eyes narrowed with malice. "I know what you're trying to do here. Make me the scapegoat for accidents that happen in dangerous work. Well, I got news for you. I ain't going down without a fight." Gideon's voice was deadly quiet when he spoke. "The only lies here are the ones you've been telling for 3 years about what really caused that mine collapse. You calling me a liar, rich boy? I'm calling you a killer." The words hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet, and Mary saw Brennan's face flush with rage. This was escalating beyond mere argument into something that could turn violent, and she was trapped in the middle of it, with labor pains that were growing stronger by the minute. "Prove it," Brennan snarled. "You got any proof of your accusations, or just the ravings of a pregnant woman who needs someone to blame for her husband's death?" Mary felt fury override her physical discomfort. "I have proof that you were fired from the Cross Creek mine for cutting safety corners. I have proof that you used the same dangerous practices at Sweetwater. And I have legal documents that transfer mine ownership to the families of the men you killed with your negligence." Brennan's eyes fixed on the papers with the intensity of a predator spotting prey. "Those documents ain't worth the paper they're printed on. Old man Cross is dead, and his guilt died with him." "But his son isn't dead," Mary replied, her voice gaining strength despite the pain. "And these documents bear his signature as well as his father's." "Forged," Brennan said flatly. "Has to be. No court in the territory would accept such obvious fraud." Gideon reached into his coat and withdrew a sealed envelope. "Then perhaps they'll accept this, a full confession from my father, written before his death and witnessed by his attorney. A detailed account of his knowledge of your unsafe practices and his failure to report them to the proper authorities." Mary stared at him in shock. This was the first she had heard of any confession, and she could see from Brennan's expression that he was equally surprised. The mine foreman's confidence wavered for the first time since entering the cabin. "You're bluffing," Brennan said, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. "Read it yourself," Gideon replied, extending the envelope. "It names you specifically as responsible for the deaths of Thomas Hale and the 4 other men who died in that collapse. It also details your current violations of territorial mining safety regulations." Brennan made no move to take the envelope, and Mary realized that he couldn't read well enough to verify its contents. His authority had always been based on intimidation and the support of men who feared losing their jobs. Faced with legal documents and written evidence, he was suddenly out of his depth. "Even if that's real," Brennan said, his voice growing desperate, "it don't matter. You file those papers, you destroy this whole town. The mine's the only thing keeping Sweetwater alive. You shut it down for safety improvements, half the men here lose their jobs, their families starve. You willing to have that on your conscience?" It was a compelling argument, and Mary could see its impact on Gideon's face. They weren't just fighting for justice, they were potentially destroying the economic foundation of an entire community. The moral calculus was more complex than simple right and wrong. Another contraction gripped Mary, stronger than any before, and this time she couldn't suppress a gasp of pain. Both men turned toward her, and she saw understanding dawn in Brennan's eyes. "Well, I'll be damned," he said with renewed confidence. "The lady's in labor. What perfect timing." His smile was cruel as he addressed Gideon. "Hard to file legal papers when you're busy playing midwife, ain't it?" "Get out," Gideon said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Get out now, before I do something we'll both regret." "Or what? You'll shoot an unarmed man in front of a woman in childbirth?" Brennan's confidence was returning as he realized their disadvantaged position. "I don't think so, rich boy. I think you're going to sit here and watch that baby come into the world. And while you're distracted, those papers are going to disappear into my coat pocket." He moved toward the table, but Gideon stepped into his path. The two men faced each other in the small cabin, the tension between them crackling like electricity before a storm. Mary realized with growing alarm that violence was becoming inevitable, and her labor was progressing too rapidly for her to escape or seek help. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke through the tension, multiple riders approaching fast. Through the window, Mary could see Timothy Fletcher racing toward the cabin on a borrowed horse, his face bright with urgency. Behind him rode Dr. Henley and Mrs. Dawson, alerted by some instinct or message that their help was needed. "Reinforcements," Brennan sneered, but his bravado was wearing thin. "Won't matter much when those papers are burning in my fireplace. Touch those documents and you'll be adding theft to your list of crimes," Gideon warned. "What crimes? All I see is a rich man's son trying to destroy honest working folks with forged papers and wild accusations." Mary felt another powerful contraction building, and with it came a moment of perfect clarity. The legal documents were important, the confrontation with Brennan was necessary, but none of it mattered as much as the life fighting to enter the world inside her. Her child, Thomas's child, was coming, whether the circumstances were ideal or not, and that birth would mark a new beginning regardless of the chaos surrounding it. "Mr. Brennan," she said, her voice cutting through the masculine posturing with the authority of impending motherhood. "This baby is going to be born today, in this cabin, whether you and Mr. Cross finish your argument or not. You can spend this time fighting over papers and past grievances, or you can help bring new life into the world. But I'm telling you right now, if you interfere with my labor or threaten my child's safety, you'll discover that a pregnant woman protecting her baby is more dangerous than any mine foreman who ever lived." The threat, delivered with the primal authority of a woman in labor, stopped both men in their tracks. Even Brennan seemed to recognize that he had encountered a force more fundamental than his own anger and desperation. Outside, Timothy's voice carried clearly as he called to the approaching adults. "She's having the baby. Mrs. Cross is having the baby, and Mr. Brennan's in there making trouble." The cavalry was arriving, bringing with them the community support that would ensure Mary's child entered a world where people looked out for each other. Whatever happened with the legal documents, whatever confrontation was yet to come with Harold Brennan, the immediate priority was clear. A new life was demanding to be born, and everything else would have to wait until that miracle was safely accomplished. Mary gripped Gideon's hand as another contraction peaked, feeling the unstoppable force of birth overriding all other concerns. The storm she and Gideon had weathered together weeks ago was nothing compared to the tempest about to break over them now. But this time they wouldn't face it alone. This time they had a community ready to stand with them, and a future worth fighting for, taking its first breath in the warmth of her small cabin. The horses outside belonged to Timothy Fletcher and Dr. Henley, arriving just as Mary's baking apron became soaked with the waters of birth. The boy had been sent to fetch the doctor when Mrs. Dawson spotted the smoke of trouble rising from Mary's cabin, and both men burst through the door to find a scene of barely controlled chaos. Dr. Henley took in the situation with the swift assessment of a man accustomed to medical emergencies. Mary doubled over with a contraction that seemed to tear through her entire body, Gideon supporting her weight while Harold Brennan stood frozen between aggression and uncertainty, his cronies backing toward the door as they realized they had stumbled into something far more complex than a simple confrontation. "Everyone out except Mr. Cross," Dr. Henley commanded, with the authority of his profession. "This woman is in active labor, and she needs space and calm." "We ain't finished here, Doc," Brennan protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Even he understood that some things transcended personal vendettas. "Yes, you are," Timothy Fletcher said with surprising firmness for a 12-year-old boy. "This is Mrs. Hale's home, and she's having her baby. Whatever business you got can wait." The sight of the orphan boy standing up to the mine foreman would have been comical under other circumstances, but Timothy's moral clarity cut through the adult complications like a blade through fog. Mary felt a surge of pride, even through her pain. This child, who had lost everything, still understood the difference between right and wrong with perfect certainty. "The papers," Brennan said, making one last desperate grab for the legal documents on the table. Gideon moved with surprising speed, scooping up the documents and the confession letter before Brennan could reach them. "These belong to the people of Sweetwater, not to you. And they'll be filed as soon as Mrs. Hale's child is safely born." Another contraction gripped Mary, and this time she felt the unmistakable urge to push. Her body had taken control of the situation, demanding that new life take precedence over old grievances. She grasped Gideon's hand with desperate strength, her baking apronte, same one she wore every morning to prepare bread for the orphans now, serving as her labor garment. "It's coming," she gasped, between waves of pain. "The baby's coming now." Dr. Henley moved with practiced efficiency, sending Timothy to fetch clean linens while he prepared for what was clearly going to be a precipitous birth. "Mr. Cross, I need you to support Mrs. Hale." "Mr. Brennan, I'm ordering you to leave this cabin immediately." But Brennan seemed rooted to the spot, his face pale as he watched Mary labor to bring new life into the world. Something in the seamy vulnerability of birth, the primal power of creation, had stripped away his bluster and left him facing something larger than his own ambitions. "Sweet Mother of God," he whispered, and Mary heard something like awe in his voice. The cabin filled with people who belonged there. Mrs. Dawson arriving with Timothy, her arms full of supplies and her face bright with anticipation. The Morrison twins peering through the window until Gideon gently shooed them away. Little Emma Carson sitting on the doorstep like a faithful guardian, refusing to leave despite the chaos inside. Through it all, Mary labored with the same determination she brought to everything else in her life. The pain was enormous, transformative, but underneath it ran a current of joy so pure it made her weep. This child, Thomas's child, was fighting to enter the world with the same stubborn courage that had carried her through months of widowhood and uncertainty. "I can see the head," Dr. Henley announced, his voice tight with concentration. "One more push, Mary. Give me everything you have." Mary bore down with all her strength, feeling her child slide from her body in a rush of fluid and relief and overwhelming love. The baby's cry filled the cabin strong, indignant, perfectly healthy, and she collapsed back against Gideon's supporting arms, with tears streaming down her face. "A daughter," Dr. Henley said, holding up the tiny, perfect form, beautiful and healthy, with her mother's fighting spirit. Mary's daughter, her daughter wailed her protest at being evicted from her warm sanctuary, and the sound was the most beautiful music Mary had ever heard. Gideon's arms tightened around her, and she could feel his tears falling into her hair as they both stared at the miracle they had witnessed. "Thomas," Mary whispered, overwhelmed with the sense that her husband was somehow present in this moment. "She has his eyes." Harold Brennan stood forgotten in the corner, his face wet with tears. He didn't seem to realize he was shedding. The sight of new life entering the world had done something to him that threats and legal documents could note. It had reminded him of his own humanity, of the preciousness of the lives he held in his hands every day in the darkness below ground. Dr. Henley placed the cleaned and swaddled baby in Mary's arms, and she felt her heart expand in ways she hadn't known were possible. This child was everything hope made flesh, love given form, the future she and Thomas had dreamed of, now breathing and real and completely dependent on her protection. "What will you name her?" Mrs. Dawson asked softly. Mary looked down at her daughter's perfect face, at the tiny fists waving in the air and the dark eyes that seemed to see everything. "Hope," she said without hesitation. "Her name is Hope Thomas Hale." The name carried weight beyond simple identification. It was a declaration, a promise, a commitment to the future her child would inherit. In choosing it, Mary was choosing to believe that the world could be better, that justice was possible, that love could triumph over fear and greed and the accumulated sins of the past. Gideon leaned down to speak quietly in her ear. "She's beautiful, Mary. Thomas would be so proud." "He is proud," Mary replied with quiet certainty. "I can feel him here with us." As if summoned by her words, the cabin filled with a sense of peace that transcended the earlier conflict. Even Harold Brennan seemed touched by it, his aggressive posture melting into something approaching reverence as he stared at the new mother and child. "Mrs. Hale," he said suddenly, his voice rough with emotion, I need to tell you something." Mary looked up at him, her daughter secure in her arms, and her heart too full of joy to hold much anger. "What is it, Mr. Brennan?" "Your husband, Thomas. He tried to warn me about those support timbers. Said they weren't strong enough, said we needed to reinforce the whole section before we continued digging." Brennan's voice broke as he continued. "I told him he was being overcautious. Said real miners didn't let fear stop them from doing their jobs." The confession hung in the air like incense, heavy with the weight of 3 years' guilt finally finding voice. Mary felt something shift inside her, not forgiveness. Exactly, but a recognition that Harold Brennan was finally facing the truth of what his choices had cost. "He died trying to save the other men when the collapse started," Brennan continued. "Could have run, could have saved himself. Instead, he stayed behind to make sure everyone else got out first. I was one of the men he saved, Mrs. Hale. I've been living with that for 3 years. Mary closed her eyes, holding her daughter closer as she absorbed this final piece of Thomas's story. He had died as he had lived, putting others before himself, choosing courage over self-preservation. The knowledge was both devastating and deeply comforting. "Thank you for telling me," she said quietly. "I needed to know." Harold Brennan nodded, then did something that surprised everyone in the cabin. He walked to the table where the legal documents still lay scattered, picked them up with careful hands, and offered them to Gideon. "File them," he said simply. "File them all. Those men deserve better than they got from me, and their families deserve the truth." The transformation was complete, not just Mary's transformation into motherhood, but Brennan's recognition of his responsibility for the past and his choice to face the consequences. In the presence of new life, old sins had finally found their way to confession and the beginning of redemption. The sound that filled Mary's cabin was unlike anything Harold Brennan had heard. In his 43 years of life, the first cry of a newborn child, pure and indignant, and absolutely, perfectly alive. Baby Hope's voice rose above the assembled crowd like a trumpet announcing a new era, and in that moment, everything changed. Brennan stood transfixed, the legal documents forgotten in his hands, as he stared at the miracle unfolding before him. This tiny, red-faced creature wailing her displeasure at the world was Thomas Hale's daughter, the child of the man whose death had haunted Brennan's conscience for 3 years. Here was innocence made flesh, hope given form, the future that his choices had almost destroyed before it could begin. "My God," he whispered, the words torn from somewhere deep in his chest. "My dear God, what have I done?" The question wasn't rhetorical, it was the cry of a man finally seeing his actions in their full context. This wasn't just about mine, safety or legal liability, or protecting his reputation. This was about the generations of children who would grow up without fathers because he had valued expedience over human life. Mary cradled her daughter against her chest, her face radiant, despite the exhaustion of labor. The baby had quieted to soft, mewling sounds, already seeking the comfort of her mother's heartbeat. Gideon knelt beside them both, his weathered face soft with wonder as he gently touched the infant's tiny fist. "She's perfect," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Absolutely perfect." "Doctor." Henley finished his medical ministrations with the efficiency of long practice. But even his professional demeanor couldn't hide his satisfaction at a successful delivery. "Mother and baby are both healthy," he announced to the assembled group. "This little one is strong as a horse and twice as determined." Timothy Fletcher edged closer, his young face bright with curiosity. "Can I see her, Mrs. Hale? I mean, if it's all right?" Mary smiled and adjusted her position so the boy could get a better view. "Of course, Timothy. You're part of our family." The words hit Brennan like a physical blow. Family. That's what Mary Hale had built here, not just charity or temporary assistance, but real family bonds among the lost and forgotten. The orphans who gathered at her door each morning weren't just recipients of her generosity. They were her chosen children, loved and protected and given a place to belong. And he had been fighting against it, fighting against the very thing that could heal the wounds his negligence had created. "Mrs. Hale," Brennan said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I got something to say, and I need everyone to hear it." The cabin fell silent except for the baby's soft sounds and the crackling of the fire. Mrs. Dawson looked up from organizing supplies. Timothy paused in his examination of the new arrival, and even little Emma Carson's face appeared in the doorway, drawn by the solemnity in the mine foreman's voice. "I killed your husband," Brennan said, the words falling like stones into still water. "Not with my hands, but with my choices." Thomas Hale warned me about those support timbers, warned me more than once, said they wouldn't hold under pressure, said we needed to stop work and reinforce the whole section. Mary's arms tightened protectively around her daughter, but her face remained calm. "What did you tell him?" "I told him he was a coward, said real miners didn't let fear rule their decisions." Brennan's voice cracked with the weight of 3 years' suppressed guilt. "I was worried about production quotas, about keeping the company owners happy. Thought one more week of digging wouldn't hurt nothing." Gideon stood slowly, his face grave, as he processed this public confession. "And when the collapse happened, Thomas saved my life." The words came out in a rush, as if Brennan had been holding them back for so long they had to be expelled all at once. Could have run when the timbers started creaking. Could have saved himself and left the rest of us to die. Instead, he stayed behind, helped get 4 men out of that hell before the whole section came down on him. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Hope's contented gurgling as she settled into sleep in her mother's arms. Mary looked down at her daughter Thomas's daughter and felt a complex mix of grief and gratitude wash over her. Her husband had died a hero's death, but that knowledge didn't ease the loneliness of the months that followed. "Why are you telling us this now?" Timothy Fletcher asked, his young voice cutting straight to the heart of the matter. Brennan looked at the boy-own of so many children orphaned by mining accidents and felt something crumble inside his chest. "Because I can't watch another generation grow up without fathers because of my choices. Because that baby deserves to inherit a world where men like me don't get to hide behind excuses and company policies." He turned to Gideon, holding out the legal documents with hands that shook slightly. "You asked me earlier what I was afraid of. I was afraid of losing everything: my job, my reputation, my place in this community. But looking at that child, I realize I already lost the only thing that really matters." "What's that?" Mary asked softly. "The right to call myself a good man." The confession hung in the air like a prayer, raw and honest, and desperately seeking redemption. Harold Brennan had spent 3 years building walls around his guilt, justifying his choices and blaming everyone except himself for the consequences of his actions. But the sight of new life entering the world had stripped away his defenses and left him facing the truth he had tried so hard to avoid. "Filing these papers won't just give ownership of the mine to the workers' families," he continued, his voice gaining strength. "It'll make me face criminal charges for negligent homicide. I could go to prison, lose everything I've worked for." "And you're willing to accept that?" Gideon asked. "I'm willing to accept what I deserve," Brennan replied. "What I should have accepted 3 years ago." Mary shifted her sleeping daughter to one arm and extended her free hand toward the mine foreman. "Mr. Brennan, what you did was wrong. What you allowed to continue happening was worse. But admitting your mistakes doesn't erase them, it just gives you the chance to do better going forward." Brennan stared at her outstretched hand as if it were a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. "You're offering me forgiveness? After what I cost you?" "I'm offering you the chance to earn it," Mary corrected gently, by making sure no other wives become widows because of preventable accidents, by helping build the kind of community where children like Hope can grow up safe and loved. Slowly, carefully, Harold Brennan reached out and took her hand. The gesture was more than simple contact. It was acceptance of responsibility, acknowledgement of harm done, and commitment to a different path forward. In the warm light of Mary's cabin, surrounded by the makeshift family she had created from love and necessity, a man who had lost his way finally found the courage to ask for directions home. "What happens now?" Mrs. Dawson asked, practically. Gideon gathered the legal documents, his face set with determination. "Now we file these papers and begin the work of building something better. The mine will belong to the community, operated according to the highest safety standards. The families of the men who died will have a voice in how their loved ones' deaths are honored." "And Mr. Brennan?" Timothy Fletcher asked. "Will face the consequences of his actions," Gideon replied. "But he'll face them as part of a community that believes in redemption as well as justice." Outside, the sun was setting over Sweetwater, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and rose. Inside the small cabin, a new chapter was beginning, not just for Mary and her daughter, but for an entire community, learning that sometimes the greatest transformations come not from grand gestures or vast wealth, but from the simple decision to choose love over fear, truth over convenience, and the courage to face the future together rather than alone. Baby Hope stirred in her mother's arms, opening dark eyes that seemed to see everything and judge nothing. In her perfect innocence lay the promise of a world where Harold Brennan's confession marked not an ending, but a beginning, the first day of a life lived in service to the community he had failed, and the first step toward becoming the man he had always had the potential to be. 6 months later, the sound of children's laughter echoed across the center of Sweetwater as Mary stood before the new community oven, Baby Hope, secure in a sling across her chest. The massive stone structure dominated the town square, built not by one benefactor, but by the collective effort of an entire community working together toward a common dream. The new oven was larger than anything Mary could have imagined during those desperate winter mornings when she had rationed her last precious flour. Built from stones gathered by the children and mortar mixed by willing hands, it could bake enough bread to feed every family in Sweetwater, with loaves left over for travelers and those in temporary need. But more than its size, it was what the oven represented that made Mary's heart swell with pride and gratitude. "Mrs. Cross," Timothy Fletcher called out, using the name Mary had adopted after her marriage to Gideon 3 months prior. "The Morrison twins want to know if they can help with the next batch." Mary smiled at the eager faces surrounding her, no longer just the original orphans, but children from throughout the community who had made the morning bread preparation a celebration rather than a chore. "Of course they can help. Everyone helps here." The transformation of Sweetwater had been neither swift nor simple. The legal transfer of mine ownership had indeed resulted in criminal charges against Harold Brennan, who had served 4 months in the territorial jail before being released under a work program that required him to oversee the implementation of new safety protocols. The man who emerged from incarceration was humbled, determined, and committed to earning the redemption he had been offered through service to the families he had wronged. Under community ownership, the mine had become a model of worker safety and profit sharing. Production had actually increased as miners worked with greater care and attention, knowing that their efforts benefited their own families rather than distant investors. The fears about economic collapse had proven unfounded when people had a stake in their workplace's success. They found ways to make it thrive. Gideon approached from the direction of their new home, a modest structure that bridged the gap between Mary's original cabin and his former isolation on the ranch. They had chosen to build their life together at the heart of the community rather than apart from it, and their house had become an unofficial gathering place for planning sessions, celebrations, and the countless small meetings that made democratic decision-making possible. The territorial inspector finished his report, he announced, his face bright with satisfaction. The Sweetwater mine has been designated as the safety standard for the entire region. Other mining operations are sending delegations to study our protocols. Mary shifted Hope to her hip, where the baby could better observe the activity around the oven. At 6 months old, Hope was a robust, curious child who seemed to find endless fascination in the daily rhythms of community life. She had never known a world where people didn't work together, where generosity wasn't the norm, where her basic needs weren't met by a network of caring adults who considered her their collective responsibility. Harold's been asked to testify before the territorial legislature about mining safety reform, Gideon continued. They want him to help draft new regulations based on what we've learned here. It was a remarkable transformation. The man whose negligence had killed 5 miners was now being consulted as an expert on preventing such tragedies. But Mary had learned that redemption often took surprising forms, and sometimes the people who had failed most dramatically were the ones best equipped to help others avoid similar failures. "And how does he feel about that?" she asked. "Terrified and honored in equal measure," Gideon replied with a wry smile, "but determined to do whatever he can to ensure Thomas's death leads to changes that will save other lives." Mary nodded, understanding Harold's complex emotions. The path from guilt to redemption was never straight, and the man who had confessed his sins in her cabin that snowy morning was still learning how to live with the weight of his past while building something better for the future. Little Emma Carson tugged at Mary's skirt, her face bright with excitement. "Mrs. Cross, can I tell Hope about the new school?" "Of course, Emma. I think she'd love to hear about it." Emma leaned close to the baby, her voice taking on the solemn importance children reserved for truly significant announcements. "Hope, you're going to have the most wonderful school when you're big enough. It's going to be right here in the community building, and everyone's going to learn together, not just letters and numbers, but carpentry and cooking and farming and music. And the best part is, if your family can't afford to send you, the community will make sure you can come anyway." The community building Emma referenced was still under construction, but already it was clear that it would be unlike any educational facility in the territory. Designed through countless community meetings and input from everyone who would use it, the building would serve multiple functions: school, meeting hall, medical clinic, and social center, all in one. More importantly, it embodied the principle that had guided Sweetwater's transformation, that everyone had something to contribute and everyone deserved a place at the table. Mary's original stone oven still sat beside her old cabin, now preserved as a monument to the simple generosity that had started everything. Visitors to Sweetwater often asked about it, curious about the humble beginning that had led to such remarkable community transformation. Mary always told them the same thing. It started with sharing what we had, even when it didn't seem like enough. As the morning bread baking concluded and families began arriving to collect their daily loaves, Mary reflected on how much had changed since those desperate winter days when she had faced the choice between feeding herself and feeding hungry children. The decision to choose generosity over self-preservation had seemed impossibly difficult at the time, but it had opened doors she never could have imagined. "Mrs. Cross," a voice called from behind her. Mary turned to see Sarah Brennan, Harold's wife, who had emerged from months of shame and isolation to become one of the community's most dedicated volunteers. "I wanted to thank you again for what you said to the territorial judge about Harold's character. Your testimony made all the difference in his sentencing." Mary had indeed spoken at Harold's trial, not to excuse his actions, but to testify to his genuine remorse and his commitment to making amends. It had been a difficult decision, one that had required her to balance justice with mercy, punishment with the possibility of redemption. But seeing Harold's transformation over the months that followed had convinced her that some people could indeed change when given the opportunity to face the consequences of their actions while still maintaining their dignity as human beings. "We all deserve the chance to become better than our worst decisions," Mary replied. "Harold is doing the work to earn that chance." As the crowd around the community oven began to disperse, Mary found herself alone with Gideon and Hope in the center of the town square. The baby was growing drowsy in the warm sunshine, her dark eyes so like Thomas's beginning to flutter closed. Mary felt a familiar pang of bittersweet emotion as she thought about the man who would never see his daughter's first steps or hear her first words. But the grief was gentler now, tempered by gratitude for the love she had found with Gideon and the community they were building together. "Do you think Thomas would approve?" she asked, the question that had haunted her quiet moments since their marriage. Gideon considered this carefully, as he always did when she spoke of her first husband. "I think he would be amazed by what his sacrifice has created. And I think he would be grateful that his daughter is growing up in a world where people take care of each other." Mary looked around at the bustling life of Sweetwater children playing in the square, adults discussing the day's work, elderly folks sharing stories on benches in the shade, and felt a deep sense of completion. This was what Thomas had died for, even if he hadn't known it at the time. This was what his insistence on safety over profit had been trying to protect. This was the legacy his death had ultimately made possible. "I think," she said slowly, "he would be proud that we found a way to turn loss into hope." Hope stirred in her arms, as if responding to her name, and Mary smiled down at her daughter's perfect face. This child would grow up in a world where generosity was normal, where community support was expected, where the idea that everyone deserved enough was not revolutionary, but simply the way things were done. She would learn to bake bread in the community oven, to share what she had with those who needed it, and to understand that individual success meant nothing without collective well-being. As the sun reached its zenith over Sweetwater, casting everything in golden light that seemed to bless the transformed community, Mary felt the profound satisfaction of a life lived in service to something larger than herself. The journey from that first desperate morning when she had faced her last sack of flour to this moment of abundance and community had been marked by loss and love, struggle and triumph, individual choice and collective action. The new stone oven would bake bread for generations of children yet to be born. Each loaf a reminder that when people choose to share what they have, even when it doesn't seem like enough, miracles become not just possible, but inevitable. The building rising in the town square would educate those children according to principles of cooperation and mutual support that had been tested in the crucible of real hardship and proven stronger than fear or greed. And somewhere in the transformed rhythms of daily life, in the laughter of children who knew they belonged, and the satisfaction of adults who had meaningful work to do, Thomas Hale's legacy lived on not in grief or guilt, but in the joyful recognition that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the most painful losses. Mary kissed her sleeping daughter's forehead and walked home with her husband, their footsteps joining the countless others that had worn paths of connection throughout Sweetwater. Behind them, the community oven stood ready for tomorrow's bread, and the promise of another day when people would choose to share what they had with those who needed it most. The circle was complete, but the story was just beginning. For every morning would bring new opportunities to choose generosity over fear, community over isolation, and hope over despair. And as long as there were people willing to make those choices, as long as there were children who needed feeding and communities that needed building, the legacy of a pregnant woman who baked bread for hungry orphans would continue to transform the world, one loaf at a time. In the end, it had never really been about the bread at all. It had been about the love that shaped the hands that made it, the community that supported its distribution, and the faith that even in the hardest times, there was always enough to share if people were willing to open their hearts as well as their cupboards. That was the lesson Hope would inherit, and the gift she would someday pass on to her own children in the continuing circle of generosity that had transformed a struggling mining town into something far more precious, a place where everyone belonged. Everyone contributed, and everyone had enough. The new stone oven would outlast them all, standing as a monument to the simple truth that had changed everything. When we feed each other, we feed ourselves. When we care for each other's children, we create a future worthy of all children. And when we choose love over fear, abundance over scarcity, community over isolation, we discover that the miracles we seek are already within our reach, waiting only for the courage to extend our hands in service to something larger than ourselves. Mary's story had become Sweetwater's story, which had become a story about the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change through the simple decision to act on their deepest values rather than their immediate fears. It was a story that would be told for generations, inspiring other communities to discover their own capacity for transformation, their own potential for turning individual generosity into collective abundance. And at the heart of it all, the stone oven continued to warm bread and hearts alike. A beacon of hope in a world that desperately needed reminding that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness have the power to change everything.